We will have an event called Documenting Child Labor, a conversation with humanitarian photographer Lisa Kristine. So I welcome you very warmly. This event is co-organized by the Permanent Mission of Luxembourg to the UN, the EU delegation to the UN, the ILO and UNICEF, and this is done within the context of the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. I will introduce in a second our very special guest. So Lisa, just bear with me for a second and I'll get to you. But before we start, I do have to do a couple of housekeeping announcements, just so that we're clear. So the first one is that this event is being recorded. There will be, unfortunately, no translation, so we're going to run the entire thing in English. There will be no interpretation. And anytime during the event, you can have your questions and answers, you can submit them through the question and answer function, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. You just click there and you put your question and we will make sure that it's being addressed. So before we hear from Lisa, and I will tell you about her in a second, I think it's critical that we all listen to our conveners. And in that sense, I will first give the floor to the permanent representative of Luxembourg to the United Nations, Ambassador Brown. Ambassador Brown, you have the question, and it's very good to see you again.
Well, thank you very much, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's a great pleasure to co-organize today's event with our partners from the European Union, UNICEF, and the ILO. We are honored to have with us today Lisa Kristine, a humanitarian photographer who has dedicated her career, which spent over 3 decades, to documenting social issues, including child labor. Nearly 1 in 10 children worldwide are subjected to child labor, with almost half of them forced into hazardous work. These children are subjected to working long hours under dire circumstances, at great risk of incurring physical and mental harm when they should be safely in school. The economic and social fallout of COVID-19 pandemic will likely increase the incidence of child labor. Job losses and sharp declines in household income are hitting already vulnerable families, putting pressure on children to contribute. Next week, the ILO, UNICEF will release a new global estimate of child labor. But the full impact of the pandemic on child labor will likely only be known in the years to come. The International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour could therefore not be timelier. This year has become all the more critical to build momentum for global effort against child labor. To this end, Luxembourg, together with the EU, UNICEF, and the ILO, will organize a high-level event called, quote, Together to End Child Labor, unquote, on 11th of June, where I hope you all will be able to join. To make a dent in confronting child labor, we need to support social protection intervention, which will allow us to tackle intergenerational poverty. We need to invest in education, and we need to include children and young people in policy discussions and decisions that affect their life. Protecting the right of every child has always been a priority for my country. And it's also a key priority for Luxembourg's Human Rights Council bid for the period of 2022 to 2024. I look forward for today's discussion with Madame Kristine, and I hope the photographs and insights she will share with us today will serve as a wake-up call for all of us to take action to end child labor. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Brown, for your your words and your references to Lisa's work, which is already giving us a flavor of what's going to come. Let me turn to our next speaker, which is Ambassador Gonzato, who's the Deputy Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. So, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you, Christian, for organizing with us this important event about the elimination of child labor, which is a top priority for the European Union. And there was a clear commitment by the President of the European Commission, President von der Leyen, to apply zero tolerance to child labor within the European Union. But promoting the rights of the child is also at the core of our human rights policy worldwide. And we have made it, and we have renewed our commitment to eradicating child labor in our EU strategy on the rights of the child and in the action plan on human rights and democracy that we adopted last year, which guides our action globally. And we're also working towards providing children with the guarantees they need and to prevent, therefore, child labor happening within the European Union and more widely. And we've done so with the European Child Guarantee initiatives, which we are discussing at the moment, which focuses on the provision of basic services such as education. So many children worldwide now are prevented from having proper education because of conflicts, famine, and all sorts of crises, but also healthcare to all the children in need. But let me also say a couple of words about Lisa. As somebody who believes that culture can be a powerful vehicle for conveying messages and for renewing our commitment to tackling issues such as child labor, I'm really pleased that you're here, Lisa. I think the way in which you use your words, I followed one of your TED Talks, and you use your images. It's so powerful. It really spurs us into action. It shakes us out of our indifference. Your images of the children in the Himalaya on Lake Volta are really such a powerful piece of journalism, but they document what's happening in the world, but they also connect us emotionally with this situation. And I think this is very important, is to foster also this empathy and make sure that we do not forget, that we do not turn away. So thank you very much for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, to seeing your images, and to the discussion that will follow from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gonzato. And I appreciate very much not only the recognition to Lisa, but also just reminding us of some of the policies and the specific actions to address this important matter. So let's move on to our next speaker. And I would like to give now the floor to Ms. Beate Andres, the Director of the ILO Office to the UN and a very esteemed colleague. So Beate, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Andres, and really good to be here with UNICEF, and a warm thank you to the EU and the Luxembourg missions for inviting the ILO to organize this event. Also, warm welcome to you, Lisa. You have supported the ILO's 50 for Freedom campaign with your powerful photos and stories. And ladies and gentlemen, when you look at Lisa's portraits, you really see the resilience of girls and boys. You see their hopes, you see their dreams. Your pictures, Lisa, have really made a major contribution in helping accelerate the ratification of ILO's convention. So many thanks. Over the next 2 weeks, we will see a massive global mobilization leading to the World Day Against Child Labour on June 12th, with events in many cities and with many children who will raise their voices. And the aim is really to solicit concrete commitments from governments, but also from businesses, from trade unions, civil society, from every organization that can make a difference in the elimination of child labor. And this campaign will also pave the ground for the 5th Global Conference, which will take place in 2022. So it is really a great pleasure to be here at this first awareness raising event in New York. Now, this kind of action is really urgently needed because the COVID pandemic has left a deep scar in many children's lives. Millions of women and men have lost their jobs. People in the informal economy without social protection have been hit hardest. And this is exactly where you will see child labor rise again. In rural areas, at the lower end of supply chains, and in private homes. In 2017, 4 years ago, we have already sounded the alarm bells because according to our estimates published back then, we had still seen 152 million of boys and girls in child labor. And we've also noted a reduction, a slowing down in the pace of reduction. So as we already heard from the ambassador of Luxembourg, next week, ILO and UNICEF will release new estimates. And unfortunately, we should all prepare to face our own failure to accept that millions of children are still in child labor and that the target of the SDG agenda to eliminate child labor by 2025 is getting further out of our reach. But let me close on a hopeful note, ladies and gentlemen. We know by now what kind of policies work to eradicate child labor. Strong social protection, so that vulnerable families have a safety net in the event of crisis. Free quality education, responsible business conduct, and law enforcement. So today, and in this International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor, we call on all governments to step up and to renew their commitments to end child labor by ratifying international conventions, by prioritizing children in their national budgets so that they can go to school and receive the social services they need, by creating a level playing field for businesses everywhere, and by promoting decent work for their parents. Thank you so much, and over to you, Andres.
Thank you so much, Beate. I think you have made a very good diagnosis of where we are and the things that need to be done through very firm policies from a number of stakeholders, of course, including the governments. So, Lisa, I'm going to turn over to you, but before giving you the floor, I would prefer if we do it a little informal so that you and I can talk a little bit. You will make a presentation, especially with all that publicity that you got just now saying that you're an incredible talker, and I think we've seen it. I feel that the expectation is that you make that presentation. But then I think we should talk a little bit and go deeper into some questions that I'm sure you will trigger from our audience and from myself. I have seen your bio like many others, and I would never even dare to summarize it here. But one thing that did capture my attention is that in your bio, the word passion is in many places, and the word emotion is in many places. And when I was reading what many very high-level people have said about you, these two words come frequently. So there's a lot of international recognition, but I think there is a lot of feeling in the way that the world views your contribution. So we look forward to listening to you. In UNICEF, we always say that one of the important things to address this issue is to make the children visible, to give voice to those that do not have a voice. And I think that some of your photographs managed to do both. And so I just want to add my recognition to your work. So Lisa, we are all ears and eyes, so over to you.
Well, it's just such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And thank you for taking the time. Good morning and good evening. What I'll do is share my screen and then we can begin. I'm going to begin at the beginning as a child for myself and let you know that when I was a little one, my beginnings were not very easy. And I remember sitting at the foot of my mother's bookshelf, and she had all these National Geographics and big anthropology books. And I remember seeing people that were so covered in mud and feather and plants that they resembled the earth itself. And I was enamored by this. I remember thinking, I think from my childlike perspective, that they were unshakable, rather unlike myself. And I actually marched out into the middle of the street and I declared as a little young person that when I'm old enough, I'm gonna go out into the world and meet these people to learn what it is that they have so I could bring it in my own life. Now, fast forward, I have been documenting humanity around the world in more than 150 countries on 6 continents. And the overall umbrella is really intended to inspire unity and dignity and respect. So that some years later, I was invited to the Vancouver Peace Summit with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other Nobel laureates. And that was when I first learned about forced labor and child labor. Now, I'd known that there was some forced labor, but not to the grave extent that existed. And so today, really, and especially in honor of this International Year of the Elimination of Child Labor, I want to share my work with you and bring you on a journey to understand, or to see rather, these beautiful children in this dire circumstance. I was first introduced to forced labor in the brick kilns of India and Nepal, where certainly men and women were carrying bricks and stacking them on their heads, but also children. And you have to understand that these bricks each weigh like 3 or 4 pounds, or certainly more than 1.5 kilos each. They stack up to 18 at a time. Young people covered in this intense blanket of dust, walking monotonously to trucks nearby, where they will then unload them, but then return to the kiln again to practice the same thing. Brick kilns are very involved. There's different strata of forced labors within them. The temperatures were extremely high. In fact, the folks that brought me in, my translators, guardians, and people working undercover to get me in for these very small segments of like 10 or 15 minutes wherein I could work, they were actually fainting and vomiting because of the severity of the heat. And my camera became actually too hot to touch. It ceased working altogether, and I would have to, jog back to the cruiser, have them turn on the ignition so that I could place my camera under the air conditioning to cool it so it would begin functioning again. And yet these people and these young people, all working in the kilns for endless hours every day. I mean, look at the dire stack of those bricks. Little girls and boys. And of course, because the adults were forced to work the entire time, the ones that were too young to stack bricks, unlike this boy, but more like these kids, they're sort of left on their own to their own devices. It was really harrowing. I remember when I first witnessed this, it was extremely challenging for me, and I actually started to cry a bit, and I was quickly reprimanded by the fellow next to me who very quickly informed me that that was not safe for myself, but more importantly to me, it wouldn't be safe for the people I was documenting. And in that instant, I had this realization that indeed, I think we can all do what we can to help. And I knew that my ability to create images was the help I could manage. And the rest of the helping of these young children would have to be at the hands of experts in the field. And I remember that being a quick realization for me at the beginning of my journey. I think often when we imagine child labor or have thought about it, we've thought of the textile industry. Indeed, those small hands can really do the detailed work. But unfortunately, these children are working in often really dark, dank areas for arduous hours. These antiquated looms are extremely powerful, and sometimes they snap. And I saw some of the children who lacked fingers due to the severity of the injuries. They work very long hours, never complaining, sweating, tirelessly moving forward. The industry, of course, is larger than that of carpets. It includes all textiles. And this image is very representative to me because it has to do with the silk dyeing, the dyeing qualities of textiles. And here we see a family portrait, the black hands being the father's and the red and the blue being his sons. Now they all take these enormous raw looms of silk and they submerge the silk as well as part of their body up to their elbows into these enormous vats of dye. But of course, in forced labor, there are not articulated measures and there are hazardous materials and often toxins in the dye. Now they realized that they were forced to work and that in fact, they weren't going to be paid a decent sum of money, let alone the children. But they knew that they had a craft. And I remember through the translator that I learned that that they hoped in the future that they could make more of an admirable way of living with this, craft that they had been taught. In the Himalayas, I witnessed young people carrying stone that actually weighs more than their body weight. Now you can imagine there's several kids, sometimes adults, that hoist these stones up on the kids' backs, and they're sort of hoisted by these sticks and ropes that drop down from the crown of their head. Here we can see these two brothers that are actually wearing clothing for school, and yet, of course, they're not in school. They're extremely dirty, and they are holding hands in order to balance each other as they go down the treacherous path of the Himalayan range to trucks below. And of course, when I think of child labor and forced labor in general, I think about how we all participate knowingly, but mostly unknowingly, by what we buy, right? By what we consume. And when I see this stone, I think, oh, is that the stone like I have in my bathroom or my kitchen? The stone is incredibly heavy. The children develop neck issues and back issues at a young age. Little girls as well that are forced to endure. And you can just see the weight of both physical weight, but also emotional weight on these kids. We're all aptly aware, I suppose, of the sex industry around the world. I know of the 43 million people that are enslaved, more than 70% are women and girls, and an enormous percentage, something like 75, are exploited. So forced labor for minors is treacherous in the sex industry. And I remember being in Nepal, where they don't have brothels, but rather what they call cabin restaurants that are dark, dingy places, often below the surface of the ground. They're separated by plywood and little curtains, and each room has a number in it. And young kids, girls and boys, certainly adults, but young ones too, endure tragic sexual assault at the hands of the purchasers. I worked as well in Sanagachi, which is Asia's perhaps largest brothel, maybe even in the world. It's enormous. And a young man who actually was raised in that area and shall forever remain anonymous brought me in. He was 20 paces ahead of me into this brothel area, and we would sweep into these areas where I would have a chance to get to know the young people that were forced to work. And once we developed some trust, I made these portraits. We have this issue, of course, all over the world, including the United States. And while I actually had done, humanitarian work in more than 150 countries, I actually had never made a photograph in my own country, the United States, until some years ago, I decided to photograph the sex industry in Washington, D.C., which is basically at the foot of the embassies there. And I saw many young girls there dressed so heightenedly sexualized and inappropriately abused. It was rather heartbreaking. Holly Smith is one of the young people that I met, and she told me the tragedy of her story, but she's an actual hero. She's all of these people, oh my gosh, they've inspired me so much in my own life. But this young Holly had been forced into prostitution when she was 14 years old. And the beauty of her being able to be released from that is that she became a biochemist. She was married and she has a very fulfilled life. And now she's an enormous advocate for forced prostitution, especially for minors, and has dedicated her life to helping others. On Lake Volta, tens of thousands of children are forced to work on this enormous body of water. I remember arriving there to kind of get a lay of the land, to see what was going on. And this is a site I saw, which I assumed to be a family out fishing for their own means and their own family. And I was quickly informed that, in fact, no, these kids were all forced to work, and the older ones as well. The older ones, though still young, have been under the hand of the laborer for a longer period of time and are said to manage these young kids. I think in that way we have to acknowledge how much this sort of forced labor can exist in situations where we don't recognize it as forced labor, but just as young people creating, being in activities of fishing or helping out at a restaurant when they actually may be forced to do it. There's a huge price in the fishing industry for the abuses of forced labor, and especially amongst children. Much like the textile industry, they are prized for their small and agile hands, the ability to remove things from the nets and to untie them. I remember I met these kids at 5 in the morning. However, they'd been working since 1 a.m., pulling in these enormous nets from the lake. There's so many of them that have to pull in these nets. But if they had the fortune of securing a great amount of fish in the lake and pulling it in, those nets would weigh nearly 1,000 pounds. That's incredible to me. I think one of the most challenging things that I've learned beyond the abuse of forcing children to work so many hours a day is that these particular children are not taught how to swim, and yet they work on, the largest man-made lake in the world. These little kids on boats. It's incredible to me. Since Lake Volta is a man-made lake, there are skeletal tree limbs that rise up from beneath the surface. And as you might imagine, when they toss those great nets out into the lake, they get tethered sometimes on those limbs beneath the surface of the water. And they literally take the children and throw them into the water to untether those nets. I just imagine what it's like to be such a young person working these countless hours a day and finishing up and then having to help out domestically around villages. Little girls and boys, all of them that I spoke to through my translator, shared stories of other kids that they knew that had drowned on that lake while they were forced to, fish. This young boy is called Kofi. I met him at a shelter where he was being rehabilitated from forced labor. These kids have to learn how to be kids again, how to laugh, how to play. And when I made this image, he was actually bathing at a big well behind the shelter, and he's all wet because he was hoisting these big buckets over his head. I learned some months later, once I had returned to the States, that he had been reunited with his parents. And what's even better is that he's being educated, of course. And he will perhaps be able to realize his potential because somebody took a stand for his rights. And that always really sits with me, that we all have this possibility to help. In Ghana, I went down illegal gold mines where miners are forced to remain beneath the surface of the earth for 48 to 72 hours at a time. They go down with 3 items: an empty bag in the hopes of filling it with gold, a couple primitive tools, and then these sort of rickety flashlights that are tethered to their head by these tattered elastic bands. Those tree limbs that you see him climbing down on, this is an illegal mine, so they're not aerated, they're not safe. In fact, those tree limbs are very slick from the moisture of the earth, and people frequently fall, and some, of course, endure falling to their death, which is a deep tragedy. When they come out of the earth, some 48 to 72 hours later, they're soaking wet from their sweat and from the moisture beneath the surface. There's kids in these mines working, and once they bring the bags of rocks up and that contain the gold, those are then transported to another site known as a pounding site. Now here you can see a lot of people with these barrels using steel rods to pound the stone into smaller pebbles and then into powder. So these children are working with all of this dust that they're breathing in. You see the young boys and young men start to get stronger and stronger. And it's, I learned that after some years, they frequently develop lung injuries and illnesses that lead to tuberculosis. It's extremely sad. Young kids pounding, you can see all these little kids using these steel beams and pounding them to create the powder that then will be sifted with water to pull the gold out. Now, beyond that, when they do mining with the water to sift the gold out, as you can see in this pool, they use mercury in the process because, of course, that mercury draws the gold away from all the other alien elements. And the waters that they work in are poisoned with mercury. And this particular image, this pool is largely full of women, but there are also young girls working in there. And of course, you can see this young boy that's too young to do anything in the foreground, just sitting in one of the buckets that's used for sifting. This is a young boy that's pulled out to hold his child while they were moving some of the tools. So as you all may know, I really want to shine a light, especially this year, on the abuse of children and child labor. When I was in the field, I photographed people that were in the element of working and in this forceful environment, but also when I had a moment and it was safe for them as well, I made these portraits with candles in order to shine a light on the situation. This body of work has meant so much to me because, of course, it's, I never, there's so many different types of the ailments of the world that I've been asked to work in. And for some reason, when I learned about what would fall under goal 8.7 for the UN Sustainability Act, it was really this work of exploitation through slavery and forced labor that somehow swept me out of myself. I actually couldn't sleep, and I had to go make this work on the front lines. And this work has been so meaningful to me because I think what it has the power to do is to transcend language and to make all those laws that we hope to impose upon others to eradicate this and all the means. I hope that it brings people out of their head and into their heart so that we have the momentum to keep moving forward. That is what I would like to share with you today. And if you all have any questions, I am certainly here for that. Thank you for having me.
Lisa, thank you so much and for such a powerful presentation. And I'm sure that everybody today has felt the same way that I have felt. And
thank you.
I encourage colleagues to please put your questions in the questions and answers, and we will try the best. Let me just start with something, Lisa. You know, one of the things in UNICEF, in a certain way, we feel it as well. You know, we're always surrounded around difficult situations, and you know what you've shown to us is difficult. It's sad. How do you find happiness when you're actually doing this work? Where do you find that happiness?
Well, I think that the notion of doing, the notion of activity, knowing that what I'm doing is shining a light on it gives me a big ray of hope, because if I was not active doing what I knew to share what I could about this issue, I don't think I'd sleep well. But beyond that, it is challenging, especially really witnessing the underbelly of society and seeing people in such grave circumstance and abuse. It's really balancing it out with my other work, which is indeed so hopeful and reverential. And it's the dualistic quality of working with what is challenging, but also what is so deeply meaningful, and knowing that beneath my overall mission, which is unity and dignity, that the elimination of child labor is possible. And I want to be a part of that movement. And that to me is very uplifting, you know?
Lisa, and when you're going to do, let's say, you know, when you went to Lake Volta, what comes before? Like, what is your research process? How do you identify the place? How do you make this decision of going to a specific place? How is that process before you actually get there?
Well, life being a collaboration, indeed, is how I think the best songs are written. And I work with other agencies on the ground, other NGOs that are doing harrowing work, and collaborate with them to shine a light on what they're doing, and to work with people that have very intimate, hands-on qualities of work in any particular area. So whenever I would fly in somewhere, I'd be with just a few people that work distinctly in that very area under that banner of forced labor. And if the labor changed in the area that I'd be working on, then the group of people I would that would bring me in would be different. And all of that work was made in these tiny little segments of like 10 or 15 minutes because of the lack of safety, mostly for the people, but also for me.
That brings me, you know, somebody in the audience is asking exactly that too. Did you ever, I'm sure you got, I'm going to ask you if you did, but I'm sure you did, you know, like a pushback from the owners of the bricks or the gold mines when you were photographing? Is there something that you can tell us from that experience?
Well, I can tell you that the great body of my overall work is made with a 19th century view camera. And I knew when I was going to do this particular work in the field that on the front lines, that I would go down to a 35 millimeter, which is very fast and agile because of the spontaneous and dangerous notion of making the work. So you're right, there's nobody that's going to lay out a red carpet for somebody coming in to show exploitation under the banner of any particular business. However, those folks, my little angels, those guardians who I revere so much, that would bring me into the situations, worked intimately, mostly undercover with these people. And they were my conduit, my introduction to making the images. And again, it was done in such a swift manner. There was, I didn't have any extra time to be there. It was very quick, very in and out.
Yeah. And Lisa, one thing, because I think you're making a very strong call to action. So when we observe your photographs and the colors and the expressions and the story behind them, I feel that you're making a very strong call to action. So my question to you is, what does any person can do? Sometimes individuals, you feel like this is too much and you sort of go into inaction mode because you can't figure out what to do. What would you advise any individual in terms of that call to action? What can he or she do?
Well, I think the beauty of life is that we can all do something. All of us. Me as a photographer can shine a light on the situation. A graphic designer can pull together a website that gives a voice to the voiceless and uses images to share and facts. We can call upon our governments to press the eradication of child labor. There is the most power, I think, that we have as a consumer, and what we choose to eat, what we choose to buy, fair trade, being more aware of where things are coming from and what the supply chain looks like, and if it includes vulnerable young people. I think there's always a beginning, and the beginning of peeling away that onion is the little steps that eventually lead up, I believe, to a tremendous shift, I think, in society, and hopefully in this case, a global society.
It's interesting what you say, because of course, as a client, I can buy apparel, I can ask questions, and some of these, there's some level of transparency, and I can make a decision. Do you have opportunities to speak to businesses? Some of them that perhaps their supply chains are a little less transparent. Like, for instance, we all have phones, and we all know that this has cobalt, and we all know that there's lots of child labor behind it. Do you have opportunities to address the companies that are producing some of these goods?
I do speak at different corporations, and I think it's really good to note that corporations such as Apple are working with an organization probably that we're familiar with here, Goodweave, to look into their supply chain. A lot of companies now are, because I think we've come to a place in the road where the layperson, the general public, is becoming aware enough of exploitation to press upon those companies to do something. I don't think even with companies going into their supply chain, I think it's going to not be an overnight sensation, being that exploitation is just being discovered over the last 10, 20 years. I think there's still so much secrecy. There's even the statistics, I don't know if they're very settled yet, especially in terms of slavery, because it's all so hidden. So I think that we have a journey to go on, and I think sharing like this is very helpful, and whenever I have that chance, I try to do that with companies.
Yeah, no, that's very good. And also, you mentioned the difficulties of having data and information. One of the things that UNICEF and ILO were always reminding governments is, please, more data, because it's so hard. And that takes me to my next question. What about governments in the places that you visit? Do you also speak to some government officials? Do they know that you're there? Do they know what you're doing? Or do you prefer to avoid that kind of contact?
Well, I think governments know what I'm doing when I'm speaking, because I will do that. I'll go to different heads of state and speak. And it's very important to me to put a voice of advocacy along with those images. When I'm out photographing, no, I don't. I'm just out doing my work. And I obviously keep as quiet as possible with that, with most of my work, actually, just to keep it low key.
Let me, there's a question that is coming from the audience, which I like, is these conversations with children, which are wonderful always. Yeah. What's their curiosity like when they see you doing what you're doing? What kind of questions do you remember that they've actually asked you? Anything?
You know, first of all, when I'm in the field in those kind of intense situations, I don't interrupt them at all. Like I try to keep, I fluidly move around them in order not to impede what is expected of them and have them pay the consequence for it. But when I did have those moments to talk with kids, kids are so full of heart. They're so full of curiosity. And I think they're mostly curious about my camera and seeing their photo on the back. They love that. They didn't really ask me too many questions, but to be fair, I had in those moments to speak with them very little time. In the case of the young people that were working in the dyeing industry, I remember them, as I expressed, knowing that they had a talent. And I love that they knew that they had a talent, and they also were educated to know that they could be paid for it if they can get out under the hands of this forced labor. And hearing that kind of like uplifting knowledge, knowing that they're on the road to success in whatever incremental period that may take, is always really moving to me.
Now, there's another question from the audience, which is also related to, they have two questions. One is, in these conversations with children, did you sense that they knew what was going on with them? You know, I think in a way, you know, there's some social norms in different societies, and then it's accepted that this happens. But I wonder if you perceived at some point that they knew what was happening from your own interest in their situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually think more often, depending on the place, a lot of the young people didn't know. A lot of the young people, I think, were either forced in the situation along with their parents, or perhaps it was inherited generationally, in which case they certainly wouldn't know. There were some kids that knew that something wasn't right. But I think kids are so in the moment and so coping, like there's just such amazing, that resilience of the human heart, and to embrace what is and to move forward. I think kids have that very powerfully. There were a few situations like with the gold where there were young people who knew they were being exploited. It was pretty clear to me, and they were exhausted. And there was a few other examples where the folks that were working undercover with them to educate them undercover and to allow them to get to know their rights, you could see that there was an arc of their understanding. But most often, honestly, I felt like the kids didn't really know. They were more doing than being aware, as perhaps they couldn't be, of what's happening.
No, thanks for that, Lisa. Did you, you know, when you're in the field with children, one of the things that I've seen is that when you show them their pictures, I mean, I've done that myself, they're always fascinated with the pictures. Have you shown some of those pictures to them, like at the moment or afterwards? So what's their reaction?
Oh, they love it. That's all giggles. That's all good stuff. That's all warmth and joy and laughter and a break from the heavy burden that lies on them out of that moment, you know? That's just the greatest thing.
Now, one question, Lisa. So let's say you go to a place like the one you've shown. I'm sure, I'm not a photographer myself, but I know that photographers take many pictures, many of them. How do you select? Like you know, you have this, you know, I'm sure hundreds of them. What is your own process? What are you looking for? How do you say this one is the one that I'm going to put in this presentation today?
Oh, I look for the images that directly, viscerally speak to me the loudest, that touch in my gut and they touch in my heart and they make my hair rise on my arms. And I know very immediately that that image and the person in it has a story that will translate visually to somebody's heart and soul. I know that. And that's how I select the images.
Fantastic. And one thing that I'm getting from the audience is there's a lot of curiosity about if there is a big project in your mind right now that you're working on or that you're thinking of.
Oh my goodness, I have a few projects. So, you know, the longest I've been on the ground is a month in 3 decades. And now with COVID, it's been a bit of time, but I'm waiting for some countries to open up. So I'm in negotiations and planning with a few museums around the world to bring the exhibition out to raise more awareness. One very exciting project I'm working on is a curriculum on slavery and forced labor, including child labor, that will most certainly be a part of the exhibition, but also we're testing it out with some schools here in the United States. Photographically, I'm hoping to be going down to Mexico sometime in the next year or so to do some work that I had planned there. I had a few things that were placed on hold. And also to head to Mongolia to do my other work. However, I've just gotten news this morning that while they'll allow people in, there's still a quarantine measure, even for those of us that are vaccinated. And because I am not only a photographer, but also a partner and mother of 3, I don't want to have too much time quarantining in another country and miss the intimacy with my kids. So all in good time, but I will jump off eagerly when the right moment awaits.
Good. No, that sounds like quite exciting. And I'm curious about this. Do you talk to your kids about what you see happens to other kids? You know, what are those conversations at home like?
Oh yeah, we do talk about exploitation, and 2 of my kids are involved in helping in their community for young people to understand what exploitation is and how it can happen. But no, they know about slavery. And in fact, years ago when I was preparing for my TED Talk, my son would listen to me, and then I'd see him walking around stacking Legos on his head as though they were bricks in the kiln, you know, like just how kids take things in. And he would say, "That's not right. That's not right, Mommy." I mean, that's the beauty of children, right? Because they're the fire keepers for the next generation. And the more they know and the more active they are in securing the world and demanding it be a good one, I think the better we'll be in the future.
Yeah. Have you had any member from your family be with you when you're taking these photographs?
No.
You've done it by yourself. Do you share with them when you come back? I'm curious about, do you show them what you did?
I show them the work once I have some room from it and I have an understanding of how it's landing with me emotionally, because I certainly don't want my children to be afraid for me when I'm out there. And the work is obviously dangerous. There's been precarious and dangerous situations that I don't think are very, make kids feel too good. So I'm pretty, careful about what I share, but also really honest about what's happening in the world and how we have to be heightenedly aware, especially as young people.
And this brings me to a question that we're getting from the audience is yourself feeling unsafe. You said there were a couple of occasions where you felt like that. Can you give us an example of one of those?
Oh yeah. Well, there's cases in which we heard that the labor holders, the slave holders were returning, and you could see them in the brick kilns coming from a distance in their car and the dust kicking up. And the folks that were with me, there was usually 4 or 5 people, one at my side when I'm working because I'm so submerged, and then a few around the perimeter to see what's happening. And when we were alerted, it was like grab and run. And there's other times when I've been down the illegal gold mines and, security's up with AK-47s, hearing about a photographer and, having to remain underground and hide for a period of time. And most frighteningly, really, to me, was when I was doing the work in Washington, D.C., and I was working undercover, and I was wired and dressed in jeans and boots and a North Face jacket, but I had little hidden cameras and walking on the ground to see what was occurring within this horrible sex trafficking ring. And at one point, 6 traffickers came across this very crowded street, crowded with buyers at 5 a.m. And they all surrounded me in what is known as a pimp circle. And I was petrified. They were grabbing me, and it was petrifying. I didn't know if I'd make it out, most certainly. And they're so harsh. I thought they're just going to kill me. And I was less worried of them grabbing me and more so of them finding the wires on my, that was under my jackets. And fortunately, the woman that I was with, who had previously been a sex slave, was able to get us out of the situation, which was harrowing and petrifying. And yeah, I really suffered after that for a time. And I was really shaken and scared. And to know that they're so organized and so powerful, and to know that there's police around who do nothing, and a crowded street full of buyers that do nothing, that was scary to me.
Wow, that's quite a story, and I'm sure you have many of those. And let me ask you a question more on the substance. We talk a lot in UNICEF about addressing the root causes to be able to eliminate child labor. Does this resonate with you, like addressing the root causes? Is it something that you find it resonates when you see these very extreme situations?
Yes, of course, the resounding word would be poverty, right? This notion that people have to make dire sacrifices in order to survive, and that people that are vulnerable are more likely to come upon somebody such as a trafficker or somebody that's going to exploit them and believe a false lie of a false promise, a better education or a better job, school, and then find that they're been lied to in this horrible predicament. Poverty to me feels very dire in all of this, as I'm sure it does to all of you. And now that COVID has existed with more and more closing of schools and the people being on the move, all of these things, I think it makes children much more vulnerable to forced labor.
And yeah, absolutely. Actually, some of our colleagues before you, they were, Beate was saying how COVID has actually pushed the numbers up again. We don't know how much, but I'm pretty sure that the numbers, if we had the right data, would show that these numbers are going up. And let me bring you to the US. I was not expecting a picture from your own country at that point, to the photograph. And does it feel different in a way that you're actually looking at your own country, a high income country with a lot of capacity, far cry, in terms of development, many other things compared to these other countries that you showed?
Yeah.
Does it feel different for you?
I think that it does feel different. I think what feels different on the onset when I began this work was the denial in our own society here in the US that this sort of exploitation occurs. And that's what prompted me to do the work in Washington, DC. But I think what's so sad is that, this sort of exploitation happens everywhere. It happens in every country. And when I was in Washington, DC, and just seeing people on the street and seeing police cars and them not doing things when there was sort of these heated elements that were occurring where girls were being definitely abused, and just them not doing anything. I think that in America, that was like, wow, that was super sad. And I know that occurs, but when it occurs a few feet from me, I was just really taken aback by that. I think this international illegal crime that's occurring is intense and dire, and I can't wait till we can get a grip on this, honestly.
Is there any way that you can that you follow up on the stories of some of the children that you photographed? Do you know of them afterwards?
There are times when I do get news, or when I check back in, but it's pretty rare that I can find them again. Most people have moved away. Like, for example, the kids with the stones, that once those images came out for a while, that ring fell apart. But it probably went up somewhere else, So there are circumstances in which I hear about people's, recovery and what they've prospered onto. And, what I've really noticed is a lot of people that are in the anti-forced labor movement have been young people that were exploited themselves. And it's no small thing when you've been in that sort of atmosphere, environment in which you're being, you're under this fear of threat, right? It's not, it's a really extreme thing. And when those people go back in and risk their lives to help others, that just like gives me the chills every time. Those stories are rather remarkable to me. I think what I've learned mostly through doing all this work is the real truth about the resilience of the human heart, how people can go through things, but that resilience is so powerful. And I've learned a lot from that.
Thanks, Lisa. We're going to start wrapping up, and what I want to do to close our conversation is, if you can, two things. One, is there something I didn't ask you that you're saying, Andres, you should have asked me this, and I wanted to answer that question that you want to share? And also a final message to all of us that you perhaps want to convey just in closing.
Well, I don't really have anything else to say regarding an unanswered question, but I will say that I'm just so moved that this year is a year of the elimination of child labor, and that all of you are so much a part of this movement and doing such tremendous, amazing work is really meaningful to me. And it's an honor to be a part of it, and it's so meaningful to me. So thank you all for sharing part of your time with me and allowing me to share my work with you, really.
Lisa, so I just, on behalf of the organizers, I just really want to thank you, not only for the amazing work that you do, but also for sharing with us in such powerful and compelling way. And I can tell you, you've touched me, and I'm sure that you've touched many others with your testimony today. And you just give us so much more strength to continue to dream and to make a reality a world free of child labor. I think I have a couple of announcements. One is that I think the organizers want a picture, I understand, from Julie. So of course you don't need to take this one, Lisa. So you're off the hook on this one. So we'll do that in a second. And then also to colleagues, just to tell you that this is one of several events that we're organizing in the context of the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. And there is one more that the Ambassador of Luxembourg announced, and I just want to remind you, the next one is on June 11 at 9 a.m.
All right.
Together to End Child Labor. So this one, of course, has the same conveners of today, the ILO, the EU, Luxembourg, and UNICEF. And on that one, we will have the President of the General Assembly, the Deputy Secretary General, and we will have the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Kailash Satyarthi. So I hope that, Lisa, you will be also ready to be with us that day.
Oh, I would love that. And I
thank you to all for your attention. And we will now proceed to the picture and to finish our session in that way. Okay. Thank you, colleagues, to all of you for participating, and to the co-organizers for a fantastic hour together. Lisa, thanks very much. Huh? You've been fantastic. You were really great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.